Chimére Smith is an author, speaker, highly requested panelist, and thought leader who unapologetically shares her long COVID journey, including balancing the effects of her disability emotionally, physically, and financially. She has been featured on CBS, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, and all the other acronyms of the alphabet, and in the Washington Post and the New York Times. She has written for Huffington Post, Medium, and She Knows. She is currently on a virtual book tour celebrating the release of Fiona Lowenstein's Long COVID Survival Guide, of which she is a contributing author and can be found at chimereladon.com. And she also works with Emmy Action, yes, to encourage diversity in volunteerism. And so grateful for all the conversations we've been having and the things that are going to come out of that initiative together, Chimére. And finally, Terri Wilder. Terri was diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome in March 2016. Since her diagnosis, she has worked with elected officials, public health departments, healthcare providers, journalists, and activists to raise awareness about ME/CFS and long COVID across the globe. Terri is currently a consultant and volunteer with Emmy Action and leads the Minnesota Emmy Action chapter. Excuse me. She was instrumental in getting a piece of legislation passed in New York State that provides for an ME/CFS education and outreach program and represents Emmy Action on the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee. And she used the skills she learned from the AIDS movement and the LGBTQ+ community to fight for the ME/CFS and long COVID community. Terri is a 1992 graduate of University of Georgia School of Social Work, and she earned her Master's of Social Work. She graduated from UGA with a Bachelor's of Social Work. All right. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for all of those who have joined us. Welcome to the panel. So the first thing, I have a lot of things that I want to talk with you all about. But one of the first things I want to ask each of you, if you could kind of briefly share, I was thinking about the title of the book, literally, that survival is in the title. And that really hit me as I kind of, the image I got as I kind of read through it was thinking about, mountain climbers on a cliff face and looking for these small little, barely perceptible handholds, footholds to stay on the cliff. And of course, like this, I think within this event, people coming here, one of the expectations we can set, this is not about performing, inspirational patient advocacy or that this is a sorry, I'm having the cognitive issues, but I'm going to take a breath, step back. So I was impressed, I was impressed upon me, and I know all of you, the stakes that we're talking about here. I'd like to talk to you about the stakes of survival of each and every one of you. And I know you guys didn't ask to, don't want to be on the cliff face, holding on for survival, don't want to see other people there, but you're trying to come along and help people. And so I at the outset of this, before we kind of go into all the different areas, I'd like each of you, if you can tell me, Fiona, as you think about the book project itself, like what did survival mean to you? How did that relate to, as you thought about the book's goals, the goals of this project that you were entering into? And for Terri, Rachel, and Chimére, like each of the pieces and contribution that you brought to this, how did you think about how you were trying to survive and how you're trying to help others survive? So Fiona, if you'd like to go.
Sure, that's such a great question. And I think, in coming up with the title, we really wanted to convey that this book is not promising a quick fix or a cure-all or some sort of, prescriptive one-size-fits-all solution to long COVID, but that we are trying to give people those survival tips that can make the difference in getting through a day or getting through a week. And so I think first and foremost, I want to say that I think this book was one of those kind of, rocks that I clung to, just in terms of my own emotional and mental health throughout this journey. The first source of that for me was the Body Politics support group. And we wanted this book to feel like a support group in book form. And the process of working on this book, working with these amazing collaborators, I learned a lot about myself from other people's chapters, and I didn't necessarily expect that to happen. But I also want to just mention that I think, when many of us got sick, there was a real lack of information on long COVID and related diseases. And that has changed. And now it almost feels like in some ways there is too much information, right? If you Google long COVID, there is kind of a plethora of stuff on the internet, everything from those quick fixes and those kind of promises of a cure-all, which, tend to be scams, to really good stuff like the support groups that many of us benefited from. And so I wanted to create kind of a path through that forest of confusing information. I think for us at the time, we needed a path through the forest of lack of information, but I wanted to really create something that would be helpful to people at all stages in their long COVID journey, but would also be helpful to people who were just starting out and wondering, okay, where do I start and how do I kind of get my footing? And I think the last thing I want to mention is that the book includes a lot of caveats in the advice. And I think Rachel could speak to this because Rachel's chapter does a lot of this, mentioning, for example, when we're encouraging various ways to access care or access, disability benefits, always including the caveat that, this may be an energy draining thing to do. And if you choose to not take that step today, that is also a valid decision. And so just honoring that there are many ways to survive and that those decisions can change over time and look different day to day.
Thanks, Fiona. Rachel, why don't you, what would you say about how you think about survival for people, the survival you were fighting for, you're part of the book, and what you were trying to communicate to other people through your contribution?
Yeah, I think that I felt really drawn to this chapter idea, and I had pitched it to Fiona because I felt so passionately about it. Because I felt like I was going through these support groups and doing my own research, or having peers help me do research on our conditions, and I was bringing this back to my healthcare professionals, and I felt like I was working with them as a team. When you found one that was kind enough to do that, because we all know that not every provider wants to work with you as a teammate. So part of the journey is even talking about like, how do you get a healthcare professional as a teammate? And yeah, so I really felt like the survival was knowing how to be the best advocate that you can be for yourself in the doctor's office, and knowing that the systems are stacked against you because we shouldn't have to do this work, but this is where we're at, and like, let me help pave a path forward, because knowledge is power. And I think that speaks to the entire chapter.
Thanks, Rachel. Chimére, we've just come through a time, holidays are really hard for a lot of people. We've got like 80 people on here, some people who may be clinging to the cliff face net right now themselves, or in DMs, chats with other people they're trying to encourage to hold on. What can you tell us about part of your journey and the message you were trying to give to the broader public?
What I've been thinking about, and I told a woman this last week, because she was asking me about her two daughters who now have long COVID, and another Black woman who is reaching out for help, right? And that's a whole other conversation. But I told her, I said, in being an advocate for yourself, no matter in what capacity it is, but especially when it comes to medical or healthcare, when I think about survival, I also think about being relentless. And so like my new motto, as I talk about advocacy in this space with chronic illness, long COVID, ME, CFS, and the other myriad of chronic illnesses that affect so many of us across the country, across the world, is I tell people that you have to think of this as you have to be relentless in this work. And like Fiona said, it doesn't have to be today. You don't have to, reach the mountain all in one day, but you do have to think about this. You have to be relentless, because as Rachel mentioned, there are doctors that are not going to want to be partners. There are people who are not going to believe. People are going to walk away from you. And so when and you're going to lose a lot, right? And so when I think about my own survival, I think about it in many different parts, but I especially think about it from a Black woman's perspective. And I always tout that, because even as I read what Fiona said, is all this information that's being poured into now our ecosystem, I do not still see, as a matter of fact, it's kind of waning our country, talking about how it's affecting the others, marginalized people, people of color. And so the first thing I thought about as I went to hospitals and I laid in my bed and was crying every day and was just perspiring and just couldn't get myself together, as I was like, I'm going to get turned down from seeing doctors because I'm Black. I'm a Black woman who knows too much. And so it was a incredible experience. And I don't mean incredible in a good way. It was an incredible, frightening situation to think about climbing a mountain. How can you think about climbing a mountain when you can't even stand up in the shower?
Yeah.
You can't even use your voice to call, to yell a name. I couldn't even yell my godmother's name out for help.
Yeah.
When I couldn't remember anything. And so my survival has been this intersectionality of my race and my gender and my education, and now where I am as it relates to my income. There's so many ways in which we are judged that we have to survive based upon how the world sees us. And so the survival technique, when I wrote my chapter, I tried very hard to invoke all of that as I thought about what it meant to survive. And I didn't want to leave anything out. And it was raw and it was real, because my mountain looked just like that. And I wanted people to know what my mountain looked like. Yeah.
It was a very powerful chapter. I was like reading it on a plane with an N95 mask, like with people are kind of looking at me weird. I'm like, what's going on? But it was, you spoke your truth, and I want to get it, and very important critical lessons that everybody hears. I want to get into it more. But Terri, we've worked together many years. We know each other's stories. I've reached out to you in some dark times too. Like, you've seen a lot on the front lines with ME/CFS for many years, people living with illness, and how ME/CFS neglect is killing people. How did you come to and think about this chapter, entering into conversation with other people with long COVID, discussing what is this moment and what you're fighting for?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting. Fiona sent out a couple of emails and I never responded because I just thought, there's people more qualified than me to do this. And I have horrible cognitive dysfunction and it makes it really hard to write. So I'm sure they can find someone else. But then I got another email. Hi, Terri, just making sure you saw this. So I thought, there's my call. Somebody really wants me to do this. It's Fiona or God or somebody. But, when I thought about this chapter, I was so grateful that Fiona recognized the connection between long COVID and ME. Because there's times that I feel like ME is not included in the long COVID conversation. And that's very unfortunate, because many of the things that people are figuring out about their bodies, we knew 25, 30, 40 years ago. And so it's important for our communities to be in coalition together and work together for collective liberation. So, when I think about this book, I think one of the things that I really didn't even think about, honestly, Ben, until you just asked this question about the title, like I didn't even think about the word survival in it. I really thought about the word guide, because I didn't have a guide when I was diagnosed with ME in March of 2016. And, you know, one of my doctors has said, you've probably had this since a child and you didn't know it. So I haven't had a guide for almost all of my life about this. And, you know, I had this one shot with my co-author to just put as much information as possible about what have I learned about cognitive dysfunction. It's embarrassing. You know, I value my brain because it pays my rent. It, you know, is part of my identity of, you know, how I want people to look at me in the world. And, you know, what do I want to tell people about that? It sucks some days when you can't put your words together, or you can't remember things, or you can't find things. But what are some things that I've learned along the way that could really help someone in hopefully a more digestible way? Because when you have cognitive dysfunction, you can't read a 500-page book about your disease, which is what happened to me in March of 2016. Somebody's like, oh, you should really read the book about the history of our disease. I'm like, I can't read a freaking page. My brain won't go there. So, you know, I just feel like this book can help folks in lots of different ways just because of how it's laid out, that you don't feel like you have to read the whole book in like one sitting, that it really is set up with these buckets of chapters with topics that I think for our communities could be more accessible and not make us feel so pressured to get that information and push ourselves and crash. You know, it kind of, I think, allows for us to adhere to some pacing by looking at this in these broken up chapters.
I love that. And so I haven't read cover to cover every page of this book yet. I'm excited. I read a bunch of different pieces, which were all great and outstanding. And I'm very excited for the forthcoming audiobook, because that's how I consume most of my books, is audiobooks. And that is, Fiona, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but like that is something I'm looking forward to too.
The audiobook became available today. So anyone can get it today. Yeah. From all the major sellers. Yeah.
I know what I'm using my Audible credit on. So that's perfect. I saw the I love Megan O'Rourke's quote on the front of the book, Fiona. I wish I had this book when I was first sick. But the thing I thought, like, coming into this, like, I'm a professional advocate in some sense. I get paid to do this work. I've been doing this for years. I've been sick for 17 years. So like my expectation, like reading this book, was like, this is going to be great. I'm so excited for the opportunity getting this information out. But I didn't, I think I was just moved at a deeper level of like how much I needed it. Like, this is not just a book for people with long COVID, as you say into it, but this speaks at many different levels. And like, Terri, your chapter on cognitive dysfunction and how it's done in this interview format, back and forth, like, I don't know, for me, like, there was like some trauma that like it brought up there, and like some recognition of like, you know, what I've lost, you know, cognitively, and to see somebody process that together, like that was, and go through those things, I'd realized, wow, I'd never had that before. Like, I haven't had or seen or been able to have this conversation, but yet with this book, I was able to hold space with these two amazing people who were dialoguing back and forth with me. And I had that experience so many times throughout the book that I was really impressed with what you had accomplished, Fiona. Like, you know, the pitch that this is a support group in book form, like, I don't think I got it until you open it up and you're like, oh. And that's because it's so, in many ways, like, they're different voices doing different things in each chapter, that like I just felt like a wealth of information and a wealth of perspectives. And Terri also knows, like, you know, I'm always looking for what can I learn from the HIV and AIDS activists and that movement. And I read a lot of different histories and perspectives. And it's interesting to see, like, you get like the one whole like singular narrative, you get very deep dives. And sometimes you need like the kind of like 3D stereo system, like, to get the full sense of it. And that's what I felt like I was dropped into. Like, I got the richness, the texture, that there is no one long COVID experience, and there's no one chronic illness experience. And so that I think was so powerful to me seeing, but if you could, Fiona, break down, like, there are a lot of different contributors, but like the overall arching goals of the book and some of the things that you're trying to do with each of the chapters, coming back to some core themes and issues, how would you explain what those are to people?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first off, I just want to say that was like the best review of all time. Thank you so much. I know that for me, I felt very strongly that, you know, one single person can't really write a guide to long COVID because our experiences are so varied, even just based on when we got sick and where we were when we got sick, you know, in addition to obviously who we are and the symptoms we experience. I would say that the book kind of has three main goals. And the first is to provide just that very visceral emotional support, the feeling that you have a friend, right? I think the number one thing that people tend to say when they enter the body politics support group, and I'm sure that's not the only support group where people say this, is, wow, I felt so alone before I got here, or I didn't realize that there were other people out there who were experiencing this. I mean, people are still saying this in 2023 when they're entering the support group, right? When there are a lot of articles about this, because the information just is not reaching everyone. So that was the number one goal, was to kind of give people, you know, that friend in book form, you know, because not everyone has sympathetic or understanding, you know, friends and family. The second goal was to provide logistical support and advice. So I think Terri mentioned that, you know, we tried to make the book as digestible as possible for people who, you know, might not have an easy time reading it from cover to cover. I know I tend to read less than I did before I got COVID. So we have a little box of survival tips at the end of each chapter that kind of summarizes the key points from that chapter. And some chapters are more logistically focused. I mean, Rachel's chapter is dense. It is a real tome on how to access care for long COVID, and includes, you know, charts of tests that you can ask your providers to run. There is a chapter in the book on dysautonomia that has a lot of practical advice on various different ways that you can try and treat dysautonomia and manage symptoms, right? And so those survival tips at the end of the chapter, you know, for those chapters really include a lot of that logistical information. But again, for some of the other chapters, the advice is more geared toward helping someone out in a moment of real emotional distress. Chimére's chapter is a beautiful essay on learning to ask for help and navigating caregiving relationships, which I think is kind of the first and most important emotional hurdle that I think many of us face in this journey. And then the last purpose that I would say the book has is just to bear witness to what we experienced and tell our own histories. And I wanted to do this because, I mean, I was a history major in college. I found myself revisiting a lot of my kind of old college syllabi and reading those primary source documents from the HIV/AIDS movement. Of course, I brought in folks like Terri and JD Davids and Nana Khanna, who, you know, were active in that movement and still are today, because we can learn so much from that movement, from the movement, you know, to recognize and treat ME/CFS, from the disability justice and disability rights movements. And I think it's important that, you know, future movements also have, you know, this as a sort of blueprint. But I also just wanted us to be able to kind of prove that we were here and that we existed and that we cared for one another. It can feel very disheartening sometimes to see our illness portrayed and misrepresented in the media. And it felt really important to be able to tell our own stories, and it was empowering to do that. So there's a lot of our own personal stories and little anecdotes. You know, I like to say, like, you're going to go to a church in Baltimore and you're going to go to, you know, an ER in New York City, and you're going to be in Long Beach, and you're going to, like, you're going to be brought into the pandemic. And I think when we did an NPR interview, the person who interviewed us said, you know, I actually think this book is really helpful for anyone who wants to process the pandemic. And so once again, I kind of wanted to serve as a historical document in that sense as well.
That's amazing. Thank you, Fiona. And I think your book did all those things. Can I ask you just a little bit more of, like, so there's a lot of table setting, expectation setting in the introduction you did, which I thought was really important. So I got the sense clearly, like, you cared about this project. It was important to you. I imagine there were some like nights you like, were up thinking about like what you don't want to have happen, what you the fears, the expectations you wanted to carefully set, the things you wanted to avoid. I think this book stands out and is I've seen a lot of mediocre advocacy in my day, I could say, from different places and sources, and this is not this. This is, to me, it made me reflect on not just on like excellence in supporting caregiving, but excellence in advocacy and activism. Like, how do we truly center and tell authentic stories that speak to these things that are going to provide the things to help people keep on this fight? But so can you tell me, just give me a little bit of a glimpse of some of the things, concerns, fights, the things you were fighting for in this book to make sure that you got it right, or you didn't get something wrong, you help people navigate around this turn, type of thing.
Yeah, so I wanted to be clear in the introduction that we're not promising recovery, full or partial, that we're not providing one size fits all advice or a cure all treatment plan. And that also we're not trying to promote hero narratives or inspiration porn, right? Some of us may talk about how we overcame certain things or how we how we climbed certain mountains, right? But we're going to try and be as real as possible in explaining, what privileges might have played a part in allowing us to do that. Also, if it was hard, like how it was hard and, how freaking hard it was. But I think we also, it was important to me to get a diversity of perspectives. My story was in the news a lot in the first phase of the pandemic, and my story is not the only long COVID story, and it's a very specific long COVID story. I mean, I'm white. I had a lot of economic privilege at the time I got sick. I had savings that I could rely upon. My symptoms are milder than many people's, and I was hospitalized when I needed to be hospitalized, right? That is not every long hauler story. And so I just felt that it was very important that we, try and capture experiences beyond the kind of whitewashed narrative that has been very, very prominent in the news cycle. In addition to that, I just wanted to make sure that we were going directly to people who had lived experiences for guidance on those specific topics, right? So, I tried to think about if I had a friend who was facing medical racism for long COVID, who would I recommend that she speak to? And it's Chimére and Carla Monteroso are like, they have talked about their stories very publicly. They have advocated about this and they have been through it. They are the experts on that. And that was, of course, kind of a guiding force as well, was just the idea that people who have lived through this are the ultimate experts on both the disease and how to, access care, how to manage all of these, emotional issues and various other issues that can come up. And then I think the final thing that I was sort of navigating was the fact that this is a book. I am a journalist, so I tend to write articles about, what happened yesterday or what happened maybe, a month ago. And the production process for a book is a lot longer. So we definitely cite research studies in this book, but we weren't going to necessarily cover, the newest research that came out yesterday or something like that. So with regards to that, I tried to once again just give more kind of evergreen tips that can help in the long term. So, for example, Lisa McCorkle of the Patient-Led Research Collaborative wrote a chapter on how to navigate research as a patient, how to navigate figuring out what you want to participate in, but also how to literally understand and read research studies. And, what does it mean for something to be peer reviewed? What are certain questions you might want to ask yourself so that you're not just at the mercy of, your neighbor saying, well, I heard, or, whatever the CNN Chiron is saying about long COVID on that given day, and you can actually investigate for yourself. Does that sort of answer your question?
No, that's great. Thank you so much. So Chimére, I want to ask you. I don't want to turn this into a reading because I've underlined too many passages from your chapter that would just turn into a straight reading if I tried to highlight them. But I did want to ask you, particularly as you articulate, very culturally specific strategies, stories of survival, things that you had to deal, the very opening of the chapter, you have, you give us, you reveal to us like a story from your journal, like an entry from your journal from the very beginning of your COVID experience. And you take us through like and excavate like the cultural stories that you were told for survival, and the stories you had to confront of medical racism around you and fighting for that. And there was one sentence in there, you said, "I became the first Black woman that you knew that didn't die from needing someone." So I'd love if you could speak a little bit to how the stories you had to wrestle with, the stories you tried to articulate it to your chapter, and how you talked about and how you think about need and care. And I guess if I'm gonna like just I'll layer a little bit on here to say like and so you can react to whichever parts are you can remember or most helpful. From your experience, like your experience of medical racism did not start with COVID-19. As a Black woman, you knew you experienced a lot of these things, and so also speaking to like how having long COVID, how having a chronic complex illness had to relearn or unlearn or take on new things that were different than some of the things maybe you expected. But anyway, I'd love to hear if you could share with some of that with the group.
Let me just say this. I'll just say this before I continue, and I want to answer both those questions. I think Fiona mentioned earlier about the number of articles. I mentioned it too. I echoed her sentiment. Their sentiment about that. What I think has happened in the long COVID and even in the MECFS history is that our country is always behind the 8 ball when it comes to these types of complex issues. Just the other day, I sent my boyfriend an article that the Washington Post wrote about spoons that was written recently. And I copied on my IG story about an article about the price that that people are paying for pacing, also that the Washington Post has recently printed. And I thought to myself, how damn ironic that all of these articles are being published now 3 years later, and 43 years later, right? And so I just want to echo that sentiment to say, how dare our media sometimes be so behind the 8 ball? How dare our government be behind the 8 ball? We are so behind, and the guide is the perfect symbol of that, right? So here we have a guide that was released a couple of months ago, and here we are just now really in worldwide media talking about spoons and pacing, right? And still not getting the definitions of those things right because you're not asking the right people. And so I wanted to just highlight that for a second. This book, it came at the right time, but it's also before its time. And it's sad that government and doctors and medical professionals won't even probably be able to process how extraordinary this guide is until probably 5 years from now, because that's how we operate, and it's unfortunate. As it relates to being a Black woman that was the first Black woman, to need someone. I'm in the house of a woman, my auntie, who's my favorite auntie, one of my favorite people in the entire world, who made her bones in her life getting it out the mud, as we say in my community. And what that means means getting it on her own. My mama, as stubborn as she is the same way. The Bishop Paula Murray, the great Paula Murray, my godmother, who I speak of so highly in the chapter, is the same way. So I am surrounded by women who have always taught me to work hard, keep my head down, don't say nothing to the white man or to the white woman, Don't rustle any feathers, you know, and don't cause no problems. And so that's always been advice that plays in my head. It played in my head. And it played in my head so much that it wasn't until June of 2020 that 3 to 4 months later, after my first symptoms, that I even told my family, my blood family, that I was sick. When I went to the hospital in July of 2020 for occipital neuralgia, which the doctors denied at the time, no one knew but my godmother that I was in the hospital. This might be a shock to some people. I never told anybody because I was afraid of looking weak. We don't ask for help. I had already gone to several ER visits where I was told to go the hell home. You're fine, go home. So that on
Chimére,
top of what I had been, the mantra that lived.
Some audio issues? Or...
I'm sorry, are you having, I'm sorry.
Oh, maybe, yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, yes, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Unstable. Not yours, go ahead.
Okay,
it's my problem, not yours. I'm gonna stop
me?
interrupting you. Go ahead, it's me.
Okay, that's okay. So I'm gonna make this quick. And so, yeah, I just, you know, even though I know that what I was saying was an exaggeration, but the truth is in some ways it's not, because I have homegirls and close friends and family members who will tell you in a minute, like I said in the book, they would rather bite their arm off before they ask the MF for anything. And so I carried that for a very long time. And it wasn't until I started to think about, because I had all this time, I had way too much time to think about all of the things that I had been telling myself. And as I contemplated death and suicide and all these things, I thought to myself, I'm sorry, and trigger warning, I'm sorry. I thought to myself, I said, where does this come from and how can I demystify it within myself to ask my godmother for help? And the day that I did, it was emotional. It was catastrophic because I hated myself for asking for help. I hated that I was sick. Here I was, this grand teacher doing the damn thing, and I needed help from another Black woman who had taught me not to ever need anybody. And so that was that. I had to really, with the time that I had lying on my back, on my side, on my, you know, I had to ask myself these hard, and I had to challenge myself in that survival, in the mountain climbing, which I love that metaphor, Ben. I had to ask myself, when are you going to drop the act of not asking anybody for anything? And I had to ask. The second part is, Ben, honestly, I want to, you know, I want other people, you know, Terri and Rachel to speak. This was my first experience with medical racism. That's why I was so shocked. I had heard different things in my community, but it's like how a lot of things go with us. It's not until we experience it that we're able to be like, oh my goodness. I could not believe that people were looking at me, examining my skin color, wondering, was I a drug addict? Wondering where I worked, where I lived, asking all these questions that had nothing to do with my health. And I thought, I couldn't believe it. And so, as I said in the webinar before, talking about the guide, I had to be this sophisticated, sick Black woman. I had to, I'm gonna use doggy treats. I had to put on my purse and take a shower and make sure I wore the right bra and make sure that everything on me was clean, because I know how I have to perform in front of white people to get their attention. I have to be astute. I have to say it right. I have to look a certain way. Otherwise, you're not gonna pay me any attention. And so That's the lesson that I had to learn. That's the unfortunate lesson that I had to learn, that I had to be on point in order to get treatment. I had to remember things that long COVID had stolen from my brain that I couldn't hardly remember. I had to write copious notes through vision loss. I had to be my own superhero in order to get treatment.
And that shouldn't be. That shouldn't be for you. It shouldn't be for other people. And thank you for, I think the point of you sharing that is like, we should be mad as hell about that. And we need to change the system, because that should not exist. You should, thank you. Rachel, I want to go to you for a second. And I think it's an important, aspect, but both the overall what you're doing with your co-authors in that chapter and your particular story. There are lots of acronyms in that chapter. I loved it. I loved highlighting all the, and I think that kind of pointed to, like, in my mind, it's like this, it is important to pay attention to both the inequalities and the barriers to access, but also the narrative that that people with chronic illness encounter is that, oh, this is just a mystery illness. There's nothing that is known or can be known about it. And so, like, why do anything? And so can you speak to a little bit about what your chapter, like, you navigated and were able to find things, and not everybody experiences the same abilities, accesses, and privileges. But the point should be, like, there exists a possibility and we need to make that possible. And I think you give a really rich and unique experience that people need to understand can be possible. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. There's so much to unpack there. And I think in preparing for this conversation, one thing I had written down was I kept going to doctors and they didn't understand why I wanted tests. And I think that speaks to the fact that with these mysterious illnesses that are, not all that mysterious, there is some literature on it. It's just that a lot of doctors haven't read up on it. They think, well, why would you want a test if the test says anything? Well, I can't treat you. And I'm sitting there going, I don't want medication. They're like, okay, well, then why would we do the test? I'm like, because I need to know things about myself. I need to know if I have mitochondrial dysfunction. I need to know if I have POTS. I don't care. I mean, POTS is an example where there are actually could be some medication interventions, but with other conditions, or even not a quote unquote condition, but it's just an attribute of your body, I need to know that, because I can do my own research and figure out, what kind of clinical trials going on. Maybe hyperbaric oxygen or something like that could somehow help that mitochondrial dysfunction that I uncovered. So I really wanted to convey that in a story, and in the chapter with the framework that we developed, because I think it's just such an essential part of being the detective of your own illness. And in my case, my biggest discovery was the kind of post-concussion syndrome that I was diagnosed with in 2021.
And your point really is not that, like, everyone has, I think sometimes when people share their stories, people are like, oh, well, maybe I have exactly that. And your point is not that, like, everyone probably has exactly this map of things, but can you talk a little bit about the methodological principle you applied in your search, and that how that helped with then ultimately seeking, like, the quality of care you wanted, because you kind of had a core vision of what you wanted to accomplish through the healthcare system?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that the overall framework is, there was two questions that started this, and it's, what is the most pressing need right now? Like, do I need to be functional so that I can go to work? Do I need to be functional, maybe not to go to work, but to be mobile around my home? Like, these are questions like, what do you need to solve right now? Because maybe that is going to a doctor and just getting the very generic tests and saying, okay, well, we need to, fix like the blood pressure issues or this and that because we need to be functional right now. And that's completely valid. And I think once I started getting past that point, then I started asking questions like, okay, well, I want to know what's going on. I want to figure this out. Let's dig into this. And that's where the second part comes in, which is the sort of framework and the way that you can dig into your own case. And the parts that we laid out in the chapter is that you can do this through investigating the long COVID theories like viral persistence or a microbiome that's out of whack. So things like that, or you can follow in your elders' footsteps towards a diagnosis of, these comorbid conditions that often occur like MECFS, POTS, EDS, or you can just crowdsource information from your peers who have had, weird blood work that has come up. And that's where we give a list of tests that say, hey, you might want to try this. But of course, none of it is medical advice. It's just our hearts poured out on the paper.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rachel. So Terri, you talked to, and again, with each of these, I feel like it's just like such small little slices that each of you are kind of giving to the book. I really encourage you to buy the book, dig in. Like there's just a wealth of things that you can help navigate in there. I really benefited from it. And Terri, I know you could speak to a lot of the same medical issues too, but I wonder if you could also speak to so there are barriers, there are things to be solved, but sometimes there isn't a magic drug, a magic pill for cognitive dysfunction, and sometimes you have to deal with you talked about also in the conversation of your chapter, processing your identity, who you were now as a disabled person, and for those who are newly ill, like everything old is new again. Chronic illness, people have been living with multi-system chronic illnesses under various names for many years, and dealing with these things. And what is some of the wisdom that you would offer your younger self or the people who are just starting out now, as what they're embarking on is in fact potentially a very long journey, maybe, and like how to give grace to themselves and walk through those really hard points when your story of yourself doesn't maybe match, or there's dissonance between what you can do experience.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have any wisdom, but I'll share with you what I thought. When I was first diagnosed in March of 2016, I was terrified, almost frozen for a year, because it was just kind of starting over and trying to figure out what this was. I have a background in HIV and I know it like the back of my hand. I know everything about it. I go to all the conferences, and now I have something that's impacting my body that, oh my God, now I need to be as versed as, I am about HIV, which is a disease I don't have. And I was just frozen and terrified and didn't want to really tell anyone. And after about a year, I think I finally gave myself permission to kind of go, this is our new reality. It's like, there's no going back. You have this diagnosis. This label has been given to you. You can make a decision about what to do with it. You can live in fear and be frozen and do nothing. Or you can start figuring out what this means and start living your life as a person who is proud of the fact that you're a person living with a disability, finding, some crip pride, if you will, for this new, reality that you're now living. And, I had to really reflect back on my friends in the HIV movement. It's like, if you're not out, then it's, silence equals death. You know, we have to be out about this. We have to talk about it because it does lots of different things for us. It helps to reduce stigma because it forces people to not just talk about this person over here that has this disease and you can throw all of these perceptions on them because you've distanced yourself from them. But no, I'm a real person. I have ME and you know me, and I can help explain to you that it's not a psychiatric illness. I don't need to be put into a psychiatric hospital. I need the frickin' NIH and the CDC and Health and Human Services and everybody else to do their fucking jobs. And, I just remember going, Terri, you fought for people with HIV to live a life full of dignity and respect. And one of those things that you talked with people about is disclosure. And that disclosure is taking your power back. And so that you can live your life without fear. And then you can go to these meetings confident and speak truth to power. Because that's the only way we're going to get what we need. And, one of the things that I'm hoping is that, this book is called, it has the word survival guide in it. I really want to move from a place through my activism and our collective activism from just merely surviving to actually thriving with this disease. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to move the needle for science and medical care so that we can have that life. And it took me a year, even though I really define myself as an activist, because it's very different when you're fighting for somebody else's life. And then you're like, holy shit, I now get it. I now get what it feels like to have a stigmatized disease. And, to really sit there and go, it is scary, but through the collective power of our people power, which Ben and I spent a lot of time today in an activism camp learning about people power, that we can make things change.
Yeah. Thank you, Terri. Anyone else? We're at the hour and I want to kind of respect people's time, energy, and spoons. But this, as much, I encourage everyone to purchase this book, to read this book, to sit and soak in it, because it is the collective, authentic and credible collection and compilation of the wisdom that exists within our community, and the fire for where we need to go. So does anyone else want to speak to, this isn't the end point, but this is a starting point for a lot that needs to come. Would anyone else like to speak to what you would like to see moving from here? The changes you hope this book sparks, or even just if there are people you've been speaking with who've read the book and some of their reactions to it, what you're hearing through those conversations. Love for anyone else to share. Fiona? Chimére, go ahead.
Of course. Okay, be quiet. Give me a chance to talk. What I'd like to see happen is, in the Black community, there's a lot of there's a lot of telling each other information, right? And so what I've been trying to advocate for more and more over the last 3 years is us not just telling each other, but actually reading to research. I learned how to research the science behind ME, CFS, and long COVID, not from Black people, because historically we're not taught to care about science and research. I learned it from a lot of white people. I learned how to analyze data and pay attention from my white counterparts. And so I am hoping that our government, our doctors, our other, even other long COVID patients who can extend their reach, those with privilege, will start thinking about how to get more information to other communities that don't have access. Because I always credit Fiona with this, and Terri, my work wife. there are so many opportunities that I would not have been able to have had people with privilege, whether it's just whiteness or more access to other spaces and other rooms. I wouldn't have even my own reach to be able to reach other Black people had it not been for people with privilege extending their hand. And so there's many more of Terri's and Fiona's and Rachel's and you, Ben, and Lori, and other people who extend their hands and their arms every single day, trying to reach people of color and others people who have been marginalized. But we need to really extend the reach further, because there's still so many people in the, I mean, I'm telling you, I get DMs out the wazoo from other Black women, mostly, who are like, oh my God, sis, you think I got long COVID? And even though I hate to answer the question, most of the time those symptoms, I'll be like, yeah, I think you do. You know, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's true. Also, it is a thing, right? But I always encourage people to get tested and take care of themselves in that way. Lastly, I wish that I kind of am, as Terri mentioned, but I'm kind of getting tired of being at the precipice of the pioneering game here, because we have enough information, enough talent, enough knowledge, enough power to be further than just the Washington Post talking about pacing and spoons. And so I laugh sarcastically when I read some of these pieces. And while I respect the journalists who take the risk, because it's still a risk to talk about ME and ME/CFS and long COVID, I just want us to move beyond that, because we could be so much further if we were telling the honest truth about everything that these conditions encapsulate. And we can be further. And it's not just clinical trials that's going to do it. It's real treatment, real information, honesty, and integrity. And we don't want to miss the integrity of talking about long COVID and ME/CFS.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chimére.
Thank you.
Rachel, anything quickly, and then Fiona?
Yeah, definitely. I think two things. First, the one thing I want people to get out of the book is just, since my chapter, or the chapter that I co-wrote is so very like functional. It is about the information. We just really wanted to get it out there because it's going to be useful. You know, every time that I spend and I talk to somebody and I hear them say, oh yeah, I had COVID and now I just can't get rid of this cough, or now I just can't get rid of, or you know what, and I'm just fatigued now. I'm like, don't settle for that. You know, let's figure this out. And so that just really, you know, tears at me, and that's why I want it to be out there. But then it also brings in what my second point is, which I want to get across. You know, I can only write a chapter on one thing, but I also feel very strongly about disability justice as well, and finding this middle ground of like, you know, we want to cure the things that causes pain, obviously, but we also want to accept that everybody is diverse, and like we are going to you know, fill this world up with people with, you know, who talk differently from one another and everything like that. So we want to also like embrace and accept the sort of challenges or just not the norm that our body gives us on the day-to-day.
Thanks, Rachel. Fiona?
I would just like to put in a plug for letting chronically ill people design their own workflows, because pretty much everyone who worked on this project was chronically ill, and we met our deadline. We got this book done on the planned schedule that we were initially given, and that had to do a lot with the creative ways that we figured out to support each other. And yeah, we also had, a lot of us had been collaborating prior to this, and so kind of knew how to do those asynchronous workflows, and, you know, not think it's weird if someone is editing a document at 3 o'clock in the morning, because that's just when they happen to be awake and feeling productive. And the last thing I wanted to just say, I put it in the chat, but We have a long COVID survival guide book exchange. If you are somebody, we'd love for you to request the book at your local library. If you are somebody who can't afford to buy a copy of the book yourself and would like to own one, you can sign up through this link that I put in the chat. And if you are somebody who has the capacity to gift a copy of the book to somebody else, you can also sign up through this link. It's myself and one other person working on this, so it may take us a few weeks to reach out. We've had a lot of signups and we're in the process of kind of sending out the first batch of books, connecting those people, but we will get in touch. And finally, if you are looking for the book at your local bookstore and they're out of stock, the book sold out pretty quickly at a lot of places. So there is a second printing that's been ordered, and it will be back in stock, we've been told, in mid-February. It's still available from what I can tell on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but if you're international or trying to buy local, you may have to wait until mid-February for that print copy, although the audiobook and the ebook are still, of course, in stock. So those are just my little logistical bits of information.
And sorry, one more thing before Terri. Fiona, I saw people asking for more webinars. There will definitely be more webinars from ME Action, but there's a whole, you will be speaking more. People can find you in more places. Do you want to give a little bit of a shout out to the other places people can find your virtual speaking tour?
Yes, so we did a bunch of conversations in the fall, all of which are linked on my website. It's just FionaLowenstein.com. And then we have upcoming events also linked there. Next Thursday, where Chimére and I and a couple of other contributors are going to be doing a virtual talk at the New York Public Library. And then following that, Terri and Chimére and a bunch of other contributors are going to be doing a virtual talk with the Columbia School of Social Work. There's also going to be a talk with NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So we have a bunch of things kind of set up for the January and February, and we'll be releasing more dates for March. So I think the easiest thing is just go to my website, FionaLowenstein.com, and check out the tab for the Long COVID Survival Guide, scroll down to events, and you can see recordings of past events and information on upcoming events.
Excellent. Thank you, Fiona. Terri?
I just want to close by just saying that I really hope that folks will get connected as in whatever way that looks like for you, because, you know, the only way that we're going to move forward with this is if we connect with each other. Just think about all the people that have ME, all the people that have long COVID, all the people that have POTS, all the people that have all of these diseases. Us joining forces, that people power can really, really move things forward. And I think it's important to never forget that in activism, there's no such thing as a single issue campaign. It's all intersectional. It is all intersectional. It is all related to, you know, we may be focusing on one thing about ME, but if you unpack it, it's sexism, it's racism, it's ageism, it's ableism. It is all interconnected to all of the issues that, you know, we're constantly worried about that are oppressing people. So please keep that in mind, that we have to join each other and we have to engage in this fight together, because if one group doesn't have freedom, none of us do. We have to fight for collective liberation.
Thank you, Terri. Can't say it better myself. So thank you all for joining us so much. Please continue to be a part of this conversation. Please go find your conversation partner. Hopefully you found people here. Continue to seek out the places where you can connect with people. ME Action, Body Politic, Patient-Led Research Collaborative, all of us, great stuff coming out of them. And we can do more together. And the rest of the world, as Fiona says in her chapter, is just gonna have to catch up to us and where we're going, because we're not stopping. So thank you all, and have a great night.